Well, hey, John Mark, thanks for being with us today. Appreciate you making it time to be on the podcast.
It's always a pleasure to have any kind of conversation with you, Jason.
Oh, you're so kind. The reality is everyone listening is thinking and experiencing life in light of COVID and shifts to our rhythms. And I just wanted to start by asking, as you're processing this time as a church leader, as a dad, as a friend, as an apprentice to Jesus, what are some of the big questions that you're wrestling with?
Well, I mean, in all honesty, I'm sure it's not that unique, but as a pastor and church leader, the question I'm wrestling with is what in the world does the next few years look like? And how do you lead a church if you can't have Sunday gatherings? And in the meantime, can't even have house churches, We could pivot pretty fast to a house church model the way our church is set up, but we can't even do that. And how do you pastor people over the internet? And how does that not just devolve way too fast into the worst of attractional kind of consumer Christianity kind of stuff? So there's all those questions that consume, a lion's share of my mind and imagination. But then there's the deeper questions that are a lot less scary to me, and where they're a little bit more less about anxiety and more about possibility. And that is I think this is the greatest chance for spiritual formation in the history of my church, at least. More good could come out of when I think about the future of Bridgetown Church, the tax exempt organization, and the brand is such a gross word, the church. I get a little in all honesty, there are moments where I have high anxiety. What will our church even look like in 2 years? But when I think about the people of Bridgetown Church that theologically are Bridgetown Church and the good that could come out of the next year or two, my heart is just full of hope. I think I was listening to this Jim Collins interview a while back. It was a long form interview with Jim Collins. And I rarely listen to business leaders. I'm not like that lead pastor. I'm trying to get out of leadership, not better at it. So I don't do a lot of that, but it was a great interview. And at one point he said that every creative and knowledge worker, in his opinion, all of their work is built around one central question. And he said what his was. And I love that paradigm. And I immediately, I knew exactly what my question was. My question is, how do people change? Specifically through the Christian lens, how do we become more like Jesus? In the language of our Eastern Orthodox friends, or the ancient church, theosis, or deification, or we would say Christ-likeness. How, if that's the telos of the spiritual journey, that's the end goal. What is there a map? Is there cartography for that spiritual journey? What is the process by which we become more like God, more godly? And because I think most of us don't give a lot of critical thinking to that. We just carry a set of assumptions into that, and we import kind of Western thinking, or Cartesian thinking, or megachurch thinking, or seminarian thinking, whatever, into that. And often we live with a chronic sense of frustration because we don't grow or change or see healing and breakthrough and renewal in the people that we pastor anywhere close to the degree that we want. So that's my deeper question. That was my question before COVID, and it will likely be my question after COVID. And that's where I actually have the most hope right now. I just think so much good could come in growth, maturity, freedom, stripping of attachments, joy, peace, emotional resolve, character, Christ-likeness. I just think there's so much potential right now.
I think one of the things that have challenged me personally, listening to you talk about personal formation, but even church leadership, is I feel like it's a different framing of the vision of a local church, or even the work of a pastor. And if I'm honest, I feel like maybe we would never say this out loud, but often I think it deep down, maybe that my job is to grow something, to expand an organization and do good in the city and all those things. But I feel like this question of this vision of forming people is something that comes through when you share. And I just wonder, has that always been the key question, or has that been a shift for you? And tell us a bit about that journey of that becoming the framework by which you think about your work as a pastor?
Yeah, I mean, first off, yes, that is the framework. So I think the true north for me is Galatians chapter 4, Paul's line, my dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. And that's where the language of spiritual formation comes
Hmm.
from. And just that word picture, Paul is like a mother, or like a father, but I mean, really, it's like the imagery is of a mother's womb, and I'm like at labor, like I labor and I sweat and I bleed until Christ is formed in you. And I just think that if you had to put the role of a pastor into one verse, it's Galatians chapter 4.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, how I got there was through pain. I mean, I think that's how we get to most of the best things in life, is through pain. That was the open window in my heart. When I started, I was a crazy type A, ambitious young leader who basically just wanted to be like a more orthodox Rob Bell. I basically just wanted like to grow a super big church, and I wanted it to be cool, and I wanted to be a killer Bible teacher. That was basically, and I'm sure I had like deeper desires for spiritual renewal and all of that, and I remember I would say some of it is not new. Some of it, like from early on, I remember when I was in my early 20s, I would say, I feel like my calling in life is to take Christians and help them become disciples. And then when
Mm-hmm.
I later read that very line from Willard, I was like, oh my gosh, you're saying what I've been like saying better than me, for years. Like, that's my heart. I'm really more of a teacher, pastor than I am evangelist, apostle. And I have great respect for that. So some of that, I think the seed bed was there in my heart, but no, it did not really show up in my body or my leadership
Hmm.
until much later, until I achieved quote success, and then the failure that often comes with success, and hit burnout and crisis of limitations, as it's called, and existential angst and early midlife crisis, and all of that like brought me, and really I hit this place of kind of a plateau in my spiritual formation. Early on, I've been following Jesus for a very long time. And in my teenage years and college and early 20s, I know that spiritual formation is not linear, but I did have a sense of like forward motion of
Hmm.
growth. And that's very biblical language, growth. I felt like year over year, I was growing like deeper and stronger and wider and becoming more like Jesus. But then in about my mid 20s, I just felt like I hit this plateau. The moment that my apprenticeship to Jesus hit up against some of the like really deep stuff that's in my family of origin, in epigenetics, if you know anything about that science, it's literally in my genetic code, that ingrained habits of sin that we often just call personality, or temperament, this stuff that's so deep, it's literally neurobiologically wired into my body and my musculature. All of the sudden, the way that I was following Jesus was
Hmm.
almost ineffective. It was like a BB gun against a tank. It was just like willpower against this was just in a theology, and willpower against me was not working. And
Hmm.
so I think then, under the pressure of leadership and the stress of all of that, and just life and getting older and the hardships of life, even though I've had a relatively easy life, I began to feel like not only was I no longer progressing, but I was regressing now. And then I began to realize that our church was full of people like me that kind of grew up to a certain point and then hit this spot of kind of plateau or even decline, or kind of they hit a
Hmm.
wall. And it was not that I did not or they did not want to grow. I did. It's not like I wasn't trying to grow. I was, if anything, trying too hard. Is that I didn't really know how to move forward and grow in full cooperation with the Spirit of Jesus. So that, I think, has really put me on a very different trajectory, asking the questions I'm asking now as I'm nearing 40 are so different than the questions
Hmm.
I was asking when I was nearing 30.
Hmm. Recently, hearing you speak to a room full of pastors, you quoted Ruth Haley Barton, and the quote was this: "The best gift you can give the people you lead is your transforming self."
Oh, I
Can you
love
speak to
that
that a little
line.
bit? It's
Yeah.
just so
Oh man,
beautiful.
it's so beautiful. And it's so funny. It's bad grammar, but proper theology. You know, like I had to think about it for a minute. The best gift you give the people you lead is your transforming self. Your transforming self.
Yeah.
That's weird grammar. But we're never transformed. It's not like, hey,
Hmm.
go do this thing, go through Ruth Levy Barton's, 2-year program, which is amazing and I highly recommend. And then you are transformed and now lead at, no, it's you're transforming and always transforming. You're never there. It's a theology of journey, not destination. And every year forward, the dream is that we become more free and more at ease in our own body and more full of genuine agape, self-giving love, and more at
Hmm.
peace and more of a non-anxious presence and more joyful, more just full of Trinitarian inner life and delight year over year over year. And I really think that's the best gift. Willard used to say the main thing that God gets out of your life and the main thing that you get out of your life is the person you become. And
Hmm.
I think you could say the same thing. The main thing that your church or the people you lead get out of your life is the person you become. It's not the consumables of ministry. It's not your teaching or your sermons or your strategy or your events or your conferences or your buildings or your programs. That's all good stuff. I'm not down on any of that. I give a lot of time to some of that. But the main thing that those are just conduits for who God is making you to be to come through. That so funny. I'm a charismatic, but I take issue with the phrase spiritual gift. I think it's really bad language. That's unbiblical. That comes from what I think most scholars would agree is not a good translation of Paul's language in Corinthians. Most of the time, and like the classic spiritual gift passages, if you actually read them carefully, they don't use the language of spiritual gifts. Romans 12 writes about gifts, but there's no adjective spiritual. Corinthians 12 writes about spirituals, and Corinthians 14, it's pneumatikos in Greek. It's most literally spirituals or spiritual things, but the word gifts is not there. The one time that spiritual and gift are used together by Paul are in Romans 1, where he calls himself the spiritual gift. He says, I long to see you that I may impart a spiritual gift to you. And he means himself. He means like, I want to come to you and I want the Spirit of God to gift something to you through me. And that's such a, that sounds egotistical, but I think it's actually humility. It's saying
Hmm.
that what we have to give is just the small fraction of Jesus that we get to mirror out through our personhood. So that's a long
Hmm.
way of saying I think character in leadership matters. I think just time and quiet prayer with Jesus and who we become matter 10,000 times more than anything else in leadership.
Hmm. I think about what we were saying earlier about like, a vision for pastoral leadership. Like obviously we believe we're called to form people, but sometimes our models are built on an old apparatus or that work out towards a whole different outcome. And I feel like my work models, like my day-to-day in and out, like I believe what you're saying, but the way I've organized my life doesn't actually live into it. I live as if people need me to build programs for them, better talks, all these things. And so what does it actually look like when that belief trickles down into how we structure our lives, our organizations, even how we mobilize our staff to become a transforming self? Wonder what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, are you talking about like for the individual leader or more for church life?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess what I'm meaning to say is this, is if the vision is to really believe that the best gift I can give my congregation is a transformed self, how does that play out in the way I organize my day-to-day life as a pastor, as a leader?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't have a brilliant answer to that. I think, what the church has said for 2,000 years up until very recently in Protestantism is rule of life.
Hmm.
That's the ancient historic church answer to that question is you craft a rule of life that is conducive both to your personality and to your cultural context, the city you live in, and to your day and age and era, of kind of late Western world and or particularly to a COVID-19 kind of crisis, and that rule of life has to be responsive and open-ended and not legalistic. It has to have some mutability to it. but basically you come up with a trellis to the vine, and that's where that language came from. Rule, or the ancient Latin word was regula, and there's dispute over it, but most scholars argue that it was the word used in Latin for the trellis under a vine in a vineyard. So if you've ever been to a winery, think of a beautiful vineyard, you think of a vine, a plant, underneath it is always a trellis. And that's because without this trellis, this kind of support structure to undergird it, a vine will languish, it might even die, it will bear a fraction of the fruit that it has the potential to bear. It will be vulnerable to wild animals, to damage, to human beings. And, the ancients said, all right, Jesus' core teaching was John 15, abide in the vine and you will bear much fruit. That's Jesus' most in-depth teaching on spiritual formation. And he's basically saying that we bear fruit, which Paul later defines in his riffing on John 15 and Galatians 5 as love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, self-control. We bear that fruit through living relational connection to God, by abiding and resting and making our home in the inner life of the Trinity itself. And so that's at a metaphoric level. And the ancients said, all right, practically the way we do that is we come up with our rule of life. We need a regula, we need a trellis. Just like a vine needs a trellis to abide in the vine, we need a support structure, a schedule, and a set of practices and relational rhythms that enable us to make our home in God and come to rest in God and really live from a relational connection to the inner life of God himself and Father and Son and Spirit. So that's like not a new answer. That's what people have been saying for 2,000 years, but I just think that's the answer. You have to come up with a rule of life that is specific to the West and specific to the city you live in, specific to your personality, and specific to your role as a pastor. So there's certain things in my rule of life that would make no sense if I was a plumber or a journalist or an entrepreneur, but they make a lot of sense for me as a teaching pastor. And that would be different if I was a different type of pastor, And so there's no one size fits all approach. There are best practices like Sabbath or morning prayer, life in community. But yeah, I think we structure a rule of life, and we have to make sure that relationships are a key part of that rule of life, because we change in relationship, from relationship by relationship, both with Jesus and with Jesus' people. And to bifurcate the two is, I think, a misnomer and a fool's errand. So our rule of life has to include real deep relationships, which is often hard for pastors. Pastors are often social, but not relational, or they're extroverted, but they're not actually in deep, mutual, little to no power differential, mutual accountability relationships of self-giving love. And man, that is, if you have to have that as a base with Jesus and with a few other people.
How has that journey been for you? Has that been something that has always been there? You've had to work at cultivating those kind of relationships in your life as a leader?
Oh no, I've come into it much later in life. I'm really introverted and grew up homeschooled and then ended up as a megachurch pastor really young. I was very comfortable with the kind of like alienate yourself from people, do your own thing, consider yourself an exception to the rule, I was very comfortable in that space. Now, it was really toxic and unhealthy and was mutating me in ways that were not Jesus-like at all. But no, that's kind of, I think, the natural inertia of my personality. So I've had to really kind of retrain my relational musculature to really live in deep, long-term, intentional, vulnerable relationships, and it's been so life-giving and so healing. And so I'm not a social person. I don't hang out with people a lot. Chronically, because of my life as a pastor, have too many relationships, but I have just a few people that I think I read a recent thing that said you can't have more than 9 to 12 people that actually know your shadow side, know you as you actually are. That's about the max for anybody, is 9 to 12 people. And so I've just worked really hard to cultivate a small circle of much wider circle of friends, but a small circle of people where I can just really show my shadow to and be safe. And I think that's so important. The more leadership, the more you're in the public eye, the more people look to you. In Jungian framework, the wider that gap is between your ego and your shadow side. Or if you're not familiar with Jungian's framework, that between that kind of image that you project to the world, both to win other people's approval and because you want to be that person, and the shadow, meaning who you actually are, good and bad. Some of the shadow is sin. Some of the shadow is just stuff you don't like about yourself. Like, I wish I, came from old money and went to Stanford and whatever. So I can pretend like I am, and I can quote people like that, but I'm not actually that guy. So it's just, some of it's just who you actually are. And like with any kind of leadership, notoriety, that gap between your ego and your shadow, between the image you present to the world and who you actually are, it grows. And that's the breeding ground for neurosis, sin, addiction, self-destructive behavior. And that's where we harm other people. This is why, like, the most extreme example of this is celebrities. And why do so many celebrities go off the rail? It's because they have this ego that's like stratospheric. It's like, it's so stratospheric, whatever the adjective is. It's out of the atmosphere. They have this image, but then who they actually are is just a normal person. They're just Justin Bieber or whoever. They're just a person with a person's flaws and idiosyncrasies and wounds and struggles. And so that's why so many celebrities just implode, even though they have all the success and wealth and fame, because they can't, that gap is untenable. And the celebrities that do well tend to have, like, their brother is their videographer and their uncle is their manager. It's like these relationships where there's low power differential and they're both accountability, but also love and affection. So that's the extreme example. Pastors aren't celebrities, but we experience a tiny bit of that, where we have this kind of public thing out there in front of a church. And often the gap grows between that public image and the shadow, the reality of who we are. And we often actually want to grow, because we don't want people to see who we are. So it's so important that we have some people to keep us grounded, who will both call out our shadow and also keep loving us through our shadow, so we can experience both freedom and healing and safety. Those relationships become more important over time, not less.
Earlier, you used this phrase, holy uncertainty. And really speaking about this season around COVID-19, not knowing the future. But I think that what this season's exposed for me is, I've never really known the future, but I've sometimes lived as a leader as if, I got all these 6-month, 8-month, 3 or 4 year plans. And then all of it's stripped away. And actually, I think there's a part of me that, for my personality, that loves the adventure. And I've actually had to come clean with my heart and be like, man, is there something about me that gets an adrenaline rush off everything that's changing? But then there's another thing I've looked inside myself and seen is like, oh man, I depend on a certain control of the future in a weird way. And it's really exposed just some needs in my heart. And just would love to hear you speak to this idea of, how do we as pastors lead in times of uncertainty? And what's the heart stuff that's going on that makes that so challenging?
Yeah, gosh, man, I think that's the conversation right now we need to be having. They say the best doctors, if you get cancer is one of the only, I'm allowed to back up, Western middle-class people have a very low tolerance for uncertainty. We're used to feeling, people that grew up in poverty know how to thrive in uncertainty. People that grew up in a war zone, our grandparents' generation that grew up in World War II, or before that, the Great Depression, they're actually much less anxious. They tend to be much happier, calmer, more comfortable, more relaxed, because they know how to navigate uncertainty. Gen Z, that has grown up even more than millennials in the greatest season of affluence in the history of the world, is the most anxious generation in history, if the data is to be believed, So there's a reciprocal relationship there between uncertainty and actually becoming people of peace, and certainty and actually becoming people of anxiety, because certainty is an illusion. It's not real life. It's not reality. It's fantasy. And so Westerners aren't used to it. The one kind of common leveler across the socioeconomic divide of Western culture is cancer. And most of us know somebody who has been through cancer or had a family member or friend go through cancer. And what I'm told, I've not been through that experience, but what I'm told by many of my friends is that there's a lot of frustration often with the medical system. And I'm just because the level of uncertainty, like literally, will you live or will you die, is so high.
Yeah.
And what I'm told on a regular basis is the best doctors are not the ones who are the smartest and make the most predictions. The best doctors are the ones who say, here's a few different ways it could go, but to tell you the truth, I don't know, but I'm with you. And I think there's a lot that leaders can learn right now from doctors. I think the best leaders right now are not the ones that are attempting to make predictions. They're the ones that are saying, here's a few different ways it could go, but I don't know. And that's okay. Jesus is with us and we're together in this. And, there's a lot of grasping for control right now, which makes sense. Like control is at the root of the human predicament. I think it's at the root of spiritual formation, or said in the inverse, it's at the root of what's wrong with the human condition. And control, for the most part, is an illusion. And control manifests like a few different things. Prediction is one. Manifestation is an attempt to grasp for control. So to say, this is what's going to happen, when in reality it's an educated guess at best, that's an attempt to grasp for control. When people say, the church will never be the same, which I'm hearing a lot of, well, who knows that? Who said that? Like, that's an attempt for control. That's all that is. People feel more in control if they can say the church will never be the same. Well, the days of big churches and buildings are over, or online church is the future. Now, maybe that's true. Maybe, I don't know. But that's an attempt at control, most likely. That's a prediction, because if we can predict the future, we can feel like we're in control of it. Now, maybe the church will never be the same. Maybe churches will never want to come back to gatherings. I don't think so. I think it'll actually have a limited effect on the future architecture of the church. Think about 9/11. Devastating. We fly on airplanes more now than we ever have before, and we just get annoyed by TSA pre-check, So I think it'll take a bit, but I would be surprised if it was the end. Not like the church hasn't been through plagues in the past. 100 years ago, the Spanish flu, we still built buildings after that. Actually, churches got bigger, not smaller. So I don't know. Maybe this is the end of megachurch. Maybe this is the beginning of digital church. I sure don't think so, and I sure don't hope so, but I don't know. But I think when people claim they know, again, I'm grateful for really intelligent people and futurists that can make predictions and educated guesses, but I think it needs to be held as this is an educated guess, and I could be totally wrong. Somebody out there is right about what will happen to the economy, about how long it'll be till we can gather as churches again, about what the future of the church is, about what that psychology of gathering will be. Somebody out there is right. I just don't know who it is. And there's a lot of smart people all making very different predictions right now based on very little data. Anger is another example of people that are struggling to live in uncertainty. Scapegoating is a great example. We scapegoat people. In my country right now, it's President Trump, or if you're a conservative, it's the media and the Democratic Party or Democratic governors. Because if we can find somebody to blame, that's another way that we can feel in control of the situation. Like, oh, it's their fault. It's China's fault, or Trump's fault, or the Democratic Party's fault, or this governor's part, or the media's fault. If we can find somebody to blame, then again, we can feel in control. But it is a fool's errand to attempt to feel in control of anything beyond like the basics in COVID-19, in particular as a leader. So all that to say, I think, the mystics and the desert fathers and mothers have long made much of what they called holy uncertainty. This, which is kind of the end goal of God stripping us of our attachments and our idols, and us coming to the true place of self-denial, the cross, yieldedness over to the Father and his wisdom and his love. And it's an ability to, as Peterson would translate it, to live freely and lightly, to just kind of have this spring in your step. Gerald Johnson, who was on here recently, he embodies that holy uncertainty. I don't need another future. I don't need, it's Jesus, take no thought for tomorrow, sufficient for the day is its own trouble. It's James 4. You're a fool to say tomorrow we'll go to this city and do such and such a thing on this. We should just say, if the Lord wills. All such boasting is evil. It's evil because it keeps us from doing the good that we often know God has set before us to do today because it doesn't fit with our plan, which again, I listened to another Eugene Peterson lecture recently, and he said that planning in secular society has taken over the role of hoping, and eschatology has been replaced by strategy. And I just thought that's so profound. We make plans to get to our preferred future, but for the disciple of Jesus, we surrender to God's preferred future for our life and his pastoring of our life. So I just think right now, the most important thing that we need to do in our own formation is release the illusion of control and yield to God and make peace. And one of the most important things that we can do for the people we lead is just lovingly say, there's a few ways it could go. We don't know. And that's okay that we don't know. God is with us. I'm with you. We're in this together. And whatever comes, comes. It's going to be okay. And I just think that's the most helpful. I could be wrong. That's just my opinion. I think that's the most helpful leadership posture right now as we kind of move forward in holy uncertainty.
When the COVID pandemic began to grow in the States and in Canada around the same time, and new restrictions were released about gathering, at Bridgetown, the church you lead, you guys released a few different initiatives. You guys articulated a rule of life for this time and released a daily podcast. Can you speak to those two things that you did pastorally for your people and those around you in light of all that was going on?
Yeah, well, on rule of life, don't get me talking too long, but if you study the history of rule of life, it goes all the way back, arguably to the 1st century and the Didache, you could argue as a rule of life, but for sure to the 2nd century. But it was really popularized by Saint Benedict in the 6th century. Either way, it grew up as a counterbalance to the decline of the Roman Empire. As the empire was falling into chaos, the church moved toward monasticism and a rule of life and fixed hour prayer. It moved toward order and a culture of chaos. It moved toward, community and a culture that was falling apart at the seams. You go to old Europe and you see some of the churches and monasteries that look like castles, and they have like turrets on the top and a moat, and you're like, how far from the heart of Jesus, who's eating and drinking with sinners, do you have to be to put like a turret on top of your church or a moat around your monastery? But then you imagine, the Roman Empire was basically a failed state, and it was devolving into warlords and violence and crime. Imagine trying to pastor a church right now in the Congo or in Mogadishu or in Syria or in any kind of a failed state. You would probably at least have like walls around your compound and bars on your window and some security guards. That's how most of the world outside of the West often operates. We don't say that's un-Christ-like. We say, yeah, that's just kind of smart. Don't kill them if they break in, but at least like warn people, So I think the point is, in a time of chaos, I think the pastoral impulse is to move toward order. So that was the rule of life, and it has to be pliable and adaptable, because obviously our life right now is very different. This is hopefully not a new normal. I don't like it when people say new normal. I don't think this is a new normal. I think this is a season that we're in. And so how do we thrive in this season and not just survive? And how do we let Jesus do a deep work in us, not just kind of get through it, grin it and bear it and endure it? And yeah, the other move was toward a daily podcast. And that was, honestly, the heart behind that was I was just in prayer those first couple of days, and I felt that, to the best of my ability to discern, like the Spirit was stirring in my heart to over communicate, not under communicate, and to prioritize pastoral presence over content curation. So I'm a perfectionist. I would rather teach 2 or 3 times a month and have it be really good. Right now I'm teaching about 5 times a week, and it's not nearly as good, a lot of it, as normal. But I just don't have the time to hone it and edit it and perfect it that I would like. And I don't think that's bad, actually. But I just feel like what people need is pastoral presence. And one way to do that is over the internet. And I'm just trying to help people ground themselves in God and really abide in Jesus through this. So our little daily podcast is more of like a prayer guide, than it is anything else. So Yeah, it's just that. I read that book Originals by Adam Grant a number of years ago, and I didn't love the book in all honesty, but my main takeaway was he has a lot of sociological actually research, and he argues that most leaders under communicate by a margin of 10,
Hmm.
meaning you need to say something 10 more times than you think you do to
Hmm.
actually enculturate it in the people that you lead. And so I've taken that to heart, and it's parts of it I don't like because I start to feel repetitive and boring and like I'm giving the same sermons, and but part of that is actually really important, that you just call people to the way of Jesus. And so yeah, right now we're just trying to be really present with people for as long
Hmm.
as this lasts.
Hmm.
I say present with people. What I mean is like calling people on the phone and producing podcasts.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of content going out, like so much content. And I think about the relationship, going back to the beginning of the conversation, of this vision of a church, of actually forming people. What does that look like now, or even outside of this time, to use content, sermons, communication piece, whatever it is, to actually move people towards formative work versus information transfer?
Yeah, it's interesting. Content's up. Podcasting is actually down right now,
Hmm.
for all the reasons that you would imagine. It's down by a significant amount, actually, because podcasting is basically a function of multitasking, and you do it while you're on your morning commute. Well, don't have
Right.
that anymore. You do it when you're at the gym. Oh, wait, don't have that anymore. You do it while you're at the airport. Oh, wait, don't have that anymore. So I think it's a very different type of podcasting that is going on right now, or content creation. Yeah, I mean, I'm not brilliant, Jason, and we're still asking all of the questions. All I know is that I think that whatever content we create right now needs to be heavy on the the praxis side of it. So like I do all of my teaching through Dallas Willard's paradigm of VIM. Are you familiar with his acronym VIM?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Vision, intention, means. Any kind of human change in general, from losing 10 pounds to becoming a person of love, you need vision of a way that you could be human, of a way that life could be different. You need intention. You have to actually make a moment of decision as the listener, as the, whatever, like I want to change and I'll do whatever it takes to change. But then you need means. You need some actual spiritual disciplines or practices. Or so if you want to, like I need to lose a little bit of weight right now, and I'm training for a marathon in October that will likely get canceled, but I'm still training for it. So first thing I need a vision of myself as somebody who's 10 pounds thinner and can run 26.2 miles. Right. But a vision is not enough. I can sit around and be like, oh, I like that. That's a great vision. I have to actually have an intention where I'm like, all right, I'm going to exercise 6 days a week. I'm going to, take these long runs. I'm going to give time to this. I'm going to push myself beyond what's comfortable. But then I need means. Then I need like a schedule and an accountability partner and some technology to track my progress and a diet regimen. Like I need to actually have some practical things in order to become the kind of person for whom running 26.2 miles is hard, but it's inside my capacity. Right now, it's outside of my capacity. I can't do it. If I went out and tried to run 26.2 miles, I would die. But it's not because I don't have that potential in me. It's because I have to become that kind of a person. So obviously, Paul uses the athletic metaphor so much for spiritual formation. So I think the same is true. We need means. So that's a long way of saying I'm just really trying. Anything that I put out, I'm really trying to end it with means. Like this last Sunday sermon, I ended with a journaling exercise.
Hmm.
I just used Rollheiser's 5 things, the Pascal cycle of, name your deaths, claim your births. And he has a couple things, it's just so beautiful. And I just did that. Like, here's a journaling exercise, because I think it was a sermon on hope and grieving. But I think people right now need more than just a sermon. They need like, all right,
Hmm.
here, if you want to do it, it's all up to you. Go take an hour. Here's 5 questions to journal through, and so that you can process your grieving and really begin hoping in what God has for you. So I think our content has to be a little bit more experiential, a little bit more spiritual director-ish, definitely less rah-rah. I don't think the rah-rah anthem thing is super helpful right now. I think like
Hmm.
helping people find spaces in solitude or in deep relationships where they can process their life before God, and really helping people reflect. Ignatius, if you look at Ignatian spirituality, was passionate about the idea that we don't change from our experiences. We change when we reflect on our experiences. So all sorts of experiences pass through our life and our body, and we honestly don't really change that much unless if we pause, slow down, and reflect on the experience. That's when it actually, neurobiologically, it's sort of fascinating thing on the role that rumination plays in changing your body, and how it's a way of retraining your body to act differently next time. When you say something stupid in a meeting and then you think about it for 3 days, like, I can't believe I said that stupid thing. There's an unhealthy aspect of rumination. A lot of people just like write rumination off, like, don't do it, it makes you sad. And some of that's wise, but actually there's actually a role it plays in the way that God designed your body. It's your brain practicing new neural pathways, so that next time you're in a situation like that, you don't run your mouth off and say something stupid. So that's, I think, that's the role of reflection. There's an unhealthy kind of rumination, but there's a healthy kind of reflection. And I want to help people kind of come into that space of reflection right now.
And this idea of moving people towards practices that are formative has really shaped the whole structure of how you guys are functioning as Bridgetown.
Right.
When did you guys begin function with that in a more intentional way? Like, it actually became an articulated form that you guys were following?
Yeah, we officially changed the kind of architecture of how we do church 3.5 years ago.
Okay.
Obviously, it was, probably about that same amount of time before that when my thinking began to change and the way of living began to change. We began to workshop and experiment and RD with our leadership group, with smaller communities. And frankly, I mean, everything we're doing is still very much R&D. It's very much research and development. And we still have a bunch of things that we want to workshop and attempt. And in fact, we're using the COVID-19 to actually start some of them, because it's like, the world is so mutable right now. It's a great time to experiment. Whatever we do is not going to last very long anyway. So it's a great time to kind of experiment with different kind of models and paradigms of church, and just really asking the question, what models of church would be the most conducive to really helping Christ be formed in people, really doing everything we can to create an environment that's just really conducive to receive the Spirit and the truth of Jesus to change.
Leading a church over the last 3.5 years in this way, what are some of the learnings that you pass on? Like, what are some of the mistakes from maybe the first year or two that you look back and go, man, if I could warn people trying to get a congregation and a group of people and even a staff on board, what are some reflections you've got on that?
In one sentence, I would say this: leadership is about example and invitation, not coercion and control.
Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So the backstory to that is, again, control, the root issue of so much what's wrong with the human condition. I'm a control freak, or a recovering control freak, or a control freak who's being healed by Jesus, however you want to say it. And so that's a real shadow side to my leadership, is I can be idealistic, I can be controlling, I can coerce people toward what I think they need to do. And sometimes I'm wrong, but sometimes I'm right. That's the catch-22 of a parent, right? When you know what your child needs to do to grow and thrive, but they don't want to do it. And it's like, how much do you override their will? I was chatting to John Ortberg a while ago, and he was chatting about Dallas Willard's idea of how every person has a kingdom or a queendom. We have the range of our own effective will. We have the space starting with our mind and our body, where what we want, or where our will is done, where what we want to happen happens. And he just had this great throwaway line. He said, I was asking him, how do you do spiritual formation with groups of people, with people in general and groups of people, which is very hard. And he said, it's very hard to lead people without overriding their kingdom. And I just think there's a lot of truth. It's very hard to lead people, actually to pastor people into Christ-likeness without overriding their kingdom. We recently got, this is kind of embarrassing because of the privilege here, but before all of this hit, actually in January, we bought a Peloton, which was really expensive, and I felt really weird buying it. And it's some of the best money we have ever spent. So Peloton, if you don't know, it's a workout. It's like a nice workout bike, extra spin bike, but it comes with like an iPad kind of on it, and you can either live stream classes from New York, or we do mostly on demand. And it's basically the best spin instructors in the world. And these spin instructors are like one part, high level elite athlete, one part like motivational speaker, self-help guru, one part like therapist. I mean, it's just unreal. You're not getting a workout, you're getting a worldview and like a massive emotional dose. And so much of it's just nonsense, just self-actualization nonsense. Some of it's great, some Christians on there, but I'm learning so much about how they motivate you. It's very different than how a pastor thinks, because they all say like, I'm not here to be your best friend. I'm going to kick your butt. You're going to hate me, but I do it because I love you. And like, because they're athletes and they're trying to actually help you grow. They're not just trying to help you feel, they're not chaplains. They're there to help you grow. They're trainers. And one of them the other day had this great line. He's like, I make suggestions, you make decisions. And I was like, oh, I am learning. I honestly feel like God brought Peloton in my life to teach me how to teach people spiritual formation, how to lead people. I honestly think like I am learning so much from these secular, totally like quasi-Hindu self-help secular people. I'm learning so much about like the science of human motivation. And all that to say, I think that coercion and control, which is what we attempted early on, like Sundays should be secondary, home communities should be first. So we're going to really lean heavy on people to get them into home communities. Spiritual formation should be first, and all the other stuff of church programs should be second. We're going to just push really heavy for people to Sabbath and do silence and solitude and prayer and fasting. And it just, every time I would try to lean on people and take them somewhere they weren't ready to go, it would blow up in my face. It would have the opposite effect. It would just harden. Either they do it, but for religious reasons, and then it would just corrupt their own spirit, or they would just like reject it and throw it off and almost rebel against it. And I just learned the hard way, that's not loving or honoring to people's human dignity. And one of the best ways we love people is we let them do things that we think they shouldn't do. Not like I always know. It's a long way of saying, I've just realized, man, it's Paul's whole thing. Follow me as I follow Christ, or follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. That's spiritual leadership. It's example. You live what you want to see in your people to the best of your current capacity in Jesus. And then you invite people to follow along the journey. Follow me as I follow Christ. Follow my example Paul said that like 4 times, be imitators of me as I am an imitator of Christ. So I just think that is spiritual leadership. Scazzero, his line is, as the leaders go, so goes the church. And I think that's really well said. That, what God is doing in your own formation and that in the highest level of leaders in your church is likely what your church has the potential to rise to. There's no guarantee, but it's very unlikely that it will rise above that. So if there's unhealth and dysfunction and irritability and shadow side in you and your leaders, again, some of that's in all of us, but that's likely going to be church-wide. Weren't you the one, Jason? You had that great, tell me that story about somebody said to you recently, like, you're the greatest threat to your church.
Oh man.
Wasn't that you? Yeah. You were at
it's true.
a pastor's gathering, and he said something like, you're the greatest blessing to your church or something.
Yeah.
The greatest danger to your church is you. Isn't that what he said to you? I don't remember who it was.
Yeah, I want to give credit to somebody, and I can't remember, but the way the idea is coming back into my memory is like
it was in Denver, right? At that church planting thing you were at?
Yeah, I think it might have been it. Okay, here's who spoke at that thing. Tim Mannon spoke. John Peacock. It might have been. Oh, it was John Peacock from Mission Church in Chicago, outside Chicago, and he said a number of things. And he did this whole bit. He was like talking to church planners, and he's like, "What's the biggest threat to your church plant?" He goes, "Is it the devil? I mean, he doesn't want your church plant to be around." He's like, "Is it secular society? I mean, that's he named all these things that are like legitimate threats." And he goes, "You're the biggest threat to your church plant."
That's so true, though.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
It's terrifying, but more churches are ruined by pastors than by anything else I know of. So there's a healthy sobriety that comes with that. Yeah. That I could be the spiritual gift to my church, or I could be its downfall. Gosh, God. So man, why do we need so much more? We got to lead in team. We got to lead grounded in relationships. We got to be aware of our shadow side. We have to be honest and open about our shadow side with the people that we lead to whatever degree is appropriate. We have to have accountability in check. We have to be grounded. We have to be patient and slow. We have to prioritize formation above all. And then we just have to invite people to come along for the journey.
I shared with a few people and some listeners that you were going to be on the podcast, and a number of people asked questions, and this is super niche. It's not a super deep moment. A lot of people asked about book recommendations. And I think it's because I know you take in a ton of books, but you also do a great job sharing it. It's like one of the best things about following you on social media is you're really honest as well. You're like, don't waste your time reading this, or like, definitely read this. And you'll be like, this is my 6th time reading it. So a couple book recommendation questions. Okay. Just for these listeners that want it. The first is, when you think about your staff, what are the books that you're like, man, I want all of the people I'm working with, they've got to read these books?
Oh man. Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership by Ruth Haley Barton is one of the best leadership books I know. It's one that our staff comes back to on a regular basis. All the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Emotionally Healthy Church. Actually, I like the original the most, Emotionally Healthy Church. Most people now read Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, which is great. But for church leaders, I still think the OG is the best. Emotionally Healthy Church is a must read. Then there's the Emotionally Healthy Leader. So, all that stuff. Scazzero's work is just gold. Our staff goes around that so much. Willard's stuff in particular for church leaders. So the problem with Willard is a couple of his books that are the most helpful are the ones that are just onerous to read, right? So the Willard book that not a lot of people read that has had the greatest impact on our church and staff is The Spirit of the Disciplines by Willard, it's not an easy read. It's slow, it's boring. I had to read it. I don't think I even started to understand it till the end of my second read through. I didn't really get it the first time. And then the second time I started getting it, and now it's like basically changed our entire model of church. And then an easier entry point to Willard would be The Great Omission is the easiest way to get into his thing. Cause it's, Great Omission isn't actually a full book. It's 50 pages. And you can read the 50 pages and basically get the synopsis of his view of formation and leadership. And then the rest of it's just like essays that got turned into chapters. And you can read them, you can not read them, you can pick and choose. They're repetitive. They don't follow a linear path. So you can kind of just read the 50 pages, that's kind of Willard's basic take on discipleship, And then Renovation of the Heart by Willard is really good. What else? There's one that's a really great introduction called The Relational Soul. That's an introduction to attachment theory, which I've discovered, and the role of small t trauma that in my work as a pastor, I'm realizing should be one of the first things that we train in as pastors. And it's one of the last things we find out about. It's a really short, easy read by 2 Christian psychologists, Plass and Clofield, that helps give you a basic, you have to go far. If you want to get into it, you have to go read more. But gives you a basic way of navigating small t trauma or big T trauma and attachment stuff. That is, I think, just crucial for pastoral work.
Okay, a couple more book recommendation questions. These legitimately came in, so I just love it. The other
You're
one was
chuckling at me right now.
I'm just chuckling that this is what people were like. I want to hear John Mark and all the stuff about rest and slow down spirituality and all the classics.
There's this thing is like a biblio doctor or whatever, like who his job is like to make book recommendations. Like, I think you're ready for this one now. I'm like, how do I get that job? Why am I a pastor? I need a biblio doctor. I want that job so bad.
It's like a dietitian for literature consumption.
Literature, please, Jesus.
Okay, the next one is a new Christian, someone just come to faith. What is the book or two you want to put in their hands early on?
I don't know. In all honesty, I'm actually working on that book right now because I haven't been able to find one that I feel great about recommending. So I'm actually working on one right now in that vein. So to start, gosh, maybe the book that played a huge role, I'm not sure if this is the right recommendation or not, but early in my formation, especially early in my journey, was The Pursuit of God by A.W. Tozer, which is a short read.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a like how to follow Jesus. It's about like the heart posture of always wanting, desiring, and pursuing God. I think that just has framed my entire spiritual journey. That one's huge. Honestly, I just read that book by our man Daryl Johnson, Experiencing the Trinity. I keep thinking of that.
Mm-hmm.
You can read it in one
Really?
sitting. It's like 90 pages long, and it's just about like how do you participate in the inner life of the Trinity of love? Like that. That's it,
Mm-hmm.
man. That's. I think like I'm working on a, and I think we had chatted about maybe collaborating on this, which I really want to do. But I'm working on like a post-alpha kind of for new follower of Jesus, like basic intro kind of discipleship formation. This is how you get going following
Yeah.
Jesus course that we want to run as part of our Practicing the Way stuff at the church. It'll be a while before it's out, but I'm working on it now. And the first 3 weeks are all on Trinitarian theology. Like it
Mm.
ends with practices and spiritual disciplines that the course will, but it just starts with like the idea that what you think about God is the most important thing about you, and you become like your vision of God, or for better or worse. So we're just like going through Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Trinitarian community of love, Trinitarian community of joy, Trinitarian community of peace, you know what I mean? Self-giving, like all generativity, like all of that. Like, man, what if we could just capture young believers' minds before we get, I mean, I'm super passionate about here's the disciplines and here's the ethics of the kingdom and the Sermon on the Mount. What if we could capture people's minds with the inner nature and life of God himself, and
Mm.
let people begin through practices and prayer and contemplative stuff to experience and enter into that inner life of the Trinity. That seems like that would be pretty amazing.
Mm. I love that. Okay, last
Another good
book.
one for a new
Oh yeah,
believer
go for it.
would be Life Without Lack, which was the last. It was published posthumously. It says it's by Dallas Willard, but he didn't actually write it. It was based on transcripts or recordings of a Sunday school class that he gave, so it's way easier to read than his other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, it's all in Psalm 23. And at the end, he has this killer chapter that I plan to rip off one day. It's called something like Spend the Day with Jesus. And it
Mm.
walks you through from when you go to bed at night to sundown on the following day, how you practice the presence of God. And that's how I'm going to end my little book that I'm working on for a new believer. And in the meantime, his is way better.
Well, that's a perfect transition, because the other book question was, what books are in your heart or mind to write? What are the books that are in you that you're hoping in your lifetime you're going to be able to write?
Oh, well, my next book's already written. It'll come out in a bit, and it's on a bunch of controversial stuff. But the real body of work that is in my heart, my life, and I want to kind of spend the next 10 or 15 years working on is I want to do like a anthology, like a series that's like probably 5 to 7 books long, and then with another 10 like shorter self-published books that go with it, all on spiritual formation. So the first
Mm.
one will be this book on basically what does it mean to be an apprentice or a follower of Jesus, that you'd like hand to somebody post alpha or brand new to Jesus, or been around the church for a long time, but like what's the difference between being a Christian and following the way of Jesus. Then I want to write like a book on abiding, like kind of practicing the presence of God, be with Jesus. And I want to write a book on become like Jesus. That'll be like the thickest one I probably will ever write, all on formation, psychology, how do we change, dealing with our past, inner healing, the role of trauma, attachment theory, discovering our unique identity, all of that stuff. And then I want to write something on kind of do what Jesus would do. And then I want to write thing on kind of naming your season of life and stage of apprenticeship and
Mm.
dark night of the soul. And then I want to write I want to create like practices that would include each like a short little book on each of the major practices. So like fasting and silence and solitude and Sabbath and prayer, just like little easy to read, probably self-published books where you could, along with teaching and stuff, where you're like, oh, I've never done fasting before. Let me grab my church or a small group or my spouse or my best buddy, and let's go through this thing over the next couple of weeks and start practicing fasting or whatever. So I think
Oh, I love
that's
it.
beyond that. I mean, I have ideas, but I don't know. That's the next 10 or 15 years, I think, is that
Thanks for sharing that.
I want to bring formation into local churches and post-Christian contexts.
I love that. Well, before I kind of ask our last question, I just want to thank you, man, for writing and teaching the way you do and making it available to us. It's been such a gift to me and so many leaders. And yeah, your voice is just so important right now. So thanks for continuing to write and craft and be thoughtful about it.
That's really kind, man. It's such an honor. I'm grateful that anybody would read or listen.
It's so fun. Okay, last kind of thought, and it's it might just be for me, but I feel like we're recording this just after Easter, and for a lot of pastors, it was like a 4-week sprint or 6-week sprint even to get online and repivot and rethink what we're doing and making tough staffing decisions and there's an adrenaline run, and I'm feeling this like post-Easter almost crash. I'm almost embarrassed about just how much it's affecting me, and I think a lot of other pastors are just feeling that, and just wanted to give you a moment just to speak to how do we come down off moments like that, and how do we find rest in the midst of it. I just think a lot of pastors and leaders are tired, and just wanted to almost let you invite pastors to a place of rest in this time.
Yeah. And I think not just invite, I think it's actually really important that we rest, because if right now we start reimagining our organizations, we're going to do it from a place of anxiety, exhaustion, fear, grasping for control. Those are not good inner postures to basically reorchestrate the next year or two of our churches based from that inner place. It's just not, you don't want to do that. So I think, just at a generic leadership level, whether it's a church or a small business, you kind of have 3 phases we have to go through. Phase 1 is kind of crisis management, like triage, crisis management. Oh my gosh, that was like the first week of like, what the heck? I mean, we had so little warning. It was not on our radar. I was halfway through writing my sermon for Sunday on Thursday at noon when I turned on my phone and found out that late the night before, they'd banned all gatherings, over 250 people. We couldn't do church that weekend, like what? That was a Thursday afternoon, So that's like just crisis management. Phase 2 is like basically pivoting your organization or your church. So it's what you just said, like, how do we get online? Do we do a daily podcast? What's our rule of life? What's church going to look like for this, stay home thing, which is likely going to be at least 3 months or whatever. Like, okay. And then phase 3 is reimagining kind of what is reentry going to look like, especially in what will likely be a staggered scenario that could be over 6 months, could be over 2 or 3 years. We don't know yet. And it's really hard. And how do we want to come back? Do we just want to come back and do the same things? Or do we want to come back differently? What's going to change? What's our staffing going to look like? All of that. And I think there is a necessary break that needs to happen between phase 2 and phase 3. I think we're all through phase 2. We've done crisis management. We've pivoted our churches to the best of our ability. And we're still a ways out. I'm not sure exactly when this podcast will go live, but we're still a ways out before any semblance of return to kind of business as usual. So I think actually right now, what we made the decision, as soon as we got through Easter, we just decided we're going to take 3 weeks and we're just going to rest. So we have a whole list of problems that we got to work on as elders, and they're all waiting for an elders meeting next week. Like we're meeting, we're praying, we're just doing spiritual direction. We're pastoring our people. We're still, we're still very present, but we're intentional, and our mind can't help but strategize, but we're intentionally not having those conversations yet, because we don't want to have them out of a place of anxiety, but out of a place of possibility. And so I think it's more important now than ever to rest. I mean, imagine like if you just played, like if you're an athlete, like I'm not a sports guy, but you just played like one of the most intense games of your life. You don't then go into the next, like the first thing that you need to do is rest, I read a book on Olympians recently that said, what separates the best from the really good at the Olympic or professional athlete level is not how hard they train, but how hard they rest. And it said that at that level, once you get to the level of professional athlete, they all basically train the same amount. So it's not the best train more. It's actually the main difference is the best of the best are ruthless about how hard they rest and how they care for their body and their spirit and their emotional condition, how seriously they take their off time. That's what separates the true premium from just the professionals. And I think there's something to that. I've been around a few really high level leaders, and I don't know them crazy well, but I've tend to be shocked by how relaxed some of them are. And it's like
Mm,
some of them are the type A crazy people working insane hours that mostly end up in a news feed for some scandal at some point. But some of the ones that flourish and thrive and lead long term, they're just healthy, happy people that actually really know how to delegate and lead from their strengths and know how to rest. So none of
mm,
us are, maybe if you're listening, but I'm not one of those people. But I think there is a principle there where rest is more important now, not less.
mm.
Sabbath is more important now than ever because it's how we remind ourselves that we're not running the universe, that we're not in control, that God is. And our job is to delight and give thanks and live one day at a time.